Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. I'm Niki Roach, and this is something new. It's an extra once a month update episode that will react to current events in water, climate and nature. We're calling it a MiniPod. It'll only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. Each MiniPod, I'll be joined by an environmental expert guest, and together we'll discuss 3 current talking points that will keep you right up to date with the latest planet positive developments. This MiniPod, my co-host, is the Chief Executive of Water New Zealand, a not-for-profit membership organisation working in the water sector in Aotearoa New Zealand, Gillian Blythe. And coming up, we'll be talking about water reform. We'll be talking about making space for water, and Gillian will be explaining why she's so passionate about taking the politics out of water. So let's get started. And firstly, a warm welcome to the MiniPod, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Niki. Great to be talking to you again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you back. So we talked previously, quite a while ago, on an episode of Planet Possible, all about water reform, and a lot has happened since then. So let's get started with that one. Tell me about water reform, Gillian.
So in October last year, we had a general election and a change of government. That brought in a number of different perspectives in terms of how we were considering water reform under the previous government. Ultimately, the critical piece was a repeal of all the legislation, which had been a mandatory requirement to set up 10 new entities. So to put it in context, we've got 67 councils who are currently responsible for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. And they were going to be merged into 10 entities and would be required to deliver those water services. Then there were some other bits that were important around co-governance. With the change of government, that was repealed in February. So now we're in the middle of the best way to think about it is a 3-bill deal. So the first one was to repeal the previous arrangements, and the second one is to put in place new arrangements, which says to the councils that we would like you to submit a water service delivery plan to the government, which sets out how you are going to be financially sustainable for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. And the expectation is that detailing that you're financially sustainable, that you will comply with all the regulatory quality requirements. So whether that's around public health, whether that's around resource consents for discharges of wastewater or stormwater into the water environment or onto land, and also economic regulation, which is a new piece for New Zealand. We've got economic regulation for other utility businesses, but we don't have it for water. And so that piece of legislation is in the process of being passed. By the time you're listening to this pod, it ought to have been passed, and we'll be starting the process towards councils producing their water service delivery plans and providing them to government. Then there's a third piece of legislation, which we're expecting probably ahead of Christmas, which is to give us more details on the economic regulation, to give us more details on the funding and finance arrangements that councils can use, and also around some of the governance arrangements. Because the expectation over time is that you won't have 67 councils doing water, that we would end up with some aggregation into some council-controlled organisations, and that they would together provide water services to local areas.
I mean, that's a lot of change, isn't it, from the direction of travel you were on? Were the 10 organisations previously going to be private companies? And so this is really saying we'll keep it in the public sector. Is that the reason for the difference?
No, there is very much a belief in New Zealand that water needs to be publicly owned, not private. One of the key concerns was that with 10 entities, that they would be very large and that you would lose the local voice.
And I know we talked on our previous episode about the challenge of ensuring the right skills, the right focus on water. There'd been quite a serious public health incident from memory, hadn't there, that had driven a lot of this water reform. So have you got any reflections on whether that's still part of the focus, given that this is a direction of travel that's slightly different to the original?
I think it is now increasingly across councils and across local government and central government. It's well understood that we need to increase our investment in water infrastructure. We need to make sure that we've got the public health measures that are right, because the incident that you're referring to is as an event in 2016 in Havelock North, where there was a serious Campylobacter outbreak. And We had in Queenstown in October through December last year, we had a cryptosporidium outbreak, and that has highlighted again the need to have multiple barrier protection for drinking water. And so one of the things that the regulator Te Aotearoa has done has written to all of the councils that do not have multiple barriers in place, so that might not have had the protozoa barrier or the bacteria barrier or had residual disinfectant, to basically say you need to write back and give me your timeline for that investment and how are you going to fund it. Because boil water notices for 3 months is not something that anybody wants.
Yeah, not sustainable. Well, interesting times, really, and I guess keeping you and your colleagues busy working out this slightly different direction of travel. Let's move on to the second topic that you wanted to talk about, which is about making space for water. Tell me a little bit more about why that's so important to you, Gillian.
So I think one of the things that was very obvious to people who were living in Auckland in late January 2023 and across Hawke's Bay and the Gisborne region in February 23 and subsequently with serious heavy rain events is that we are going to see more inundation, heavier storms impacting houses and communities and businesses. In the water sector, we all talk about making room for rivers. It's not a new expression, or making space for water. But I don't think it's as well understood outside of the water sector as it needs to be. Because unless you have faced an event when you have potentially had loss of life because of floodwaters, or you've had loss of property and livelihoods, I think it's hard to get your head around. And I think we need to have a greater conversation around this, certainly in terms of some of the conversations that I've had recently with people. I was talking about the need to make room for water, and I was asked if I was in favour of flooding communities. When clearly I'm not in favour of flooding communities. I'm in favour of protecting and looking after communities and making sure that we don't build in hazard-prone areas, and that where we do know that we've got communities at risk, that we are taking the right decisions to make sure that they know what to do.
Who does flood management in Aotearoa? Where does that sit? Is that within the local councils as well?
It's probably a combination, depending on which part of the region that you're talking about. So Auckland Council deals with it, but it's a unitary authority, so therefore it's doing both stormwater and flood management. So depending on where you are, and so there is both what happens in terms of rivers and overtopping, but also just in terms of storms within cities and urban areas.
And you've been in Aotearoa quite a while. I know you're not originally from there, but it's definitely home these days. I guess from your experience, are you seeing climate change in action now? I mean, I feel like certainly in the UK, there is much more awareness of flood warnings, of more severe weather events. We're naming storms in a way that we never used to. That, you know, we always talk about the weather here in the UK, don't we? But we're talking about it, I think, in relation to climate change more often. Is that a similar conversations happening in Aotearoa, people? And are you seeing those events more frequently, would you say?
I think we're seeing those events both from lots of water and not enough water. So, I mean, if you spoke to someone, walking down Lambton Quay, they'd probably say, but New Zealand gets lots of water. But we don't always get the right amount of water in the right places. And sometimes we get more water than we want. And so I think one of the pieces, in New Zealand, we're known for being a seismic isle. And one of the things that, you've got children that are taught in school is drop, cover, hold. You have earthquake drills such that if there is an earthquake, you know exactly what to do. And that's something that, little kids at kindergarten do as well. And I think it's one of the pieces we need to have that conversation about floodwater, about understanding about what happens if you enter floodwater that is flowing at a particular rate, or if it's up to your knees, or if it's up to your waist, and those sorts of pieces. Because I think as we see more of these events, and particularly when you've got large catchments, and if you've got cyclones that are dumping so much water, then the sheer volume is immense, and you can't assume that you won't be impacted.
I was really struck when we spoke last time about Te Aotearoa putting the health of the water first and the health of the river first, and kind of enshrining that in legislation. So I think there's a lot, certainly here in the UK, we can learn from the way that you're doing things in Aotearoa New Zealand. But maybe there's a bit of cross-learning in both directions, really.
So I think one of the things that's interesting with the change in government, there is a conversation happening around, so the Te Mana o Te Wai had a hierarchy, that the health of the water was first, then drinking water, and then social, economic and cultural third, around removing the hierarchy. So this is a change that is still being understood in terms of the policy discussions. It's a tricky one because certainly in terms of the conversations that I have been involved in, the idea of not building the stock banks high enough to manage floodwater and talking about providing that room for the river or space for water, it's around how do we manage that? Because Water New Zealand as an industry association, we've got a whakatauki, ka ora te wai, ka ora te whenua, ka ora na tangata, which if the water is healthy, the land is healthy, the people are healthy. You know, and the logic of those te reo words and the English words resonate, and the need for waterway health absolutely resonates. But when you've got different parties in different communities that are going, you're not protecting my home, what's the mitigation that you're giving me to protect my home because you allowed me to build or you allowed my business to locate? It's a really tricky area.
That takes us nicely onto our third topic, really, which is the one that you're particularly passionate about, which is how do you take the politics out of water? And we've started to talk about that a little bit more, but tell me your thoughts on how you remove the politics from water.
We have to have that conversation about healthy water, healthy land, healthy people. For some people, it will be, talk to me about the economic impacts. We will be protecting GDP growth, GDP quantum, by making sure that water is looked after. But I think it's also about making sure that we understand and explain the value of water to the broader community, such that when you're having that conversation about long life physical assets and long life decisions, that we ensure that we are not thinking in 3-year terms, because our electoral cycle in New Zealand is 3 years, which means, you know, compared to the UK, which is 5, you know, it's really short. And we need to be able to reach a view when we get to that bipartisan perspectives.
Yeah, and I think we think 5 feels short sometimes in the UK as well. So it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, how do you think really long term? And if you've got any ideas about how to engage the wider public on the value of water, I'm sure there are lots of listeners that'd be interested to hear, because I certainly think that's a global challenge, isn't it, really? And as you said earlier on, it's only when you're impacted by water often that you really start to think about it and recognise the value of how it's managed or not managed.
I think one of the things to me, it's the critical storytelling. It's about sharing the photographs. I mean, the one that is behind me is the Wellington Harbour. It's about making people think about particular waterways. There was a very passionate presentation that was given by one of the local mana whenua in Wellington, Kara Pukutapu dentist, when he talked about my awa, which is my river, is not your drain. And when you think about it in that brief sentence, it really brings it home what we can do or what we need to think about doing when we are mitigating the things that we are discharging into our waterways.
It's a really powerful sentence, isn't it, really? And I think also for me it's powerful because you recognise, certainly in Aotearoa, that it's plugged into something that's much deeper than just resources, if you like, really. It's plugged much more into community. The challenge of our mini-pods is that they're so short, but you've given us a brilliant kind of overview of some of the big stuff that's going on in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and I'm going to keep watching with interest, really, and see how all of that shakes out. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that's it for our mini-pod. I hope you've really enjoyed it. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss any of our episodes. We'd love to hear your ratings and reviews too. And we've got lots more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of the year. So I hope you'll join us for those as well. That's it, everyone. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.